welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and today we'll be talking about some of the new rules for Marvel Smash Up. I encourage everyone to read this rulebook because it's important to read the rulebooks. You'd be amazed at how many people think that a rule exists that doesn't, but I'll be going over briefly what has changed in the rulebook and what I think about it, regardless of whether or not you want to know my opinion. And I want to stress, these are my opinions. The first rule that I'll be going over is the new terminology rule. There's a couple of new terms or replaced terms, and those are character, modifier, and move. If you've been following the card previews, you already know about character and modifier. The move versus transfer is one that you may not be familiar with. Basically, move and transfer have been consolidated into one word. Anytime that you would previously refer to a transfer of action, it's now going to actually be moving that action. With a character, it's basically synonymous with minion. Every time you see minion, you see character. A lot of people are upset about this, and I understand it, but I need to stress that it is a minor inconvenience. It is annoying. I do think it's kind of weird, but it took me all of 5 seconds to get used to. When you see character, think minion, and it's equally in the other direction. It's just something that you're going to have to deal with. And at the end of the day, it really isn't that big of a deal. When you think about things that other games have done, like inadvertently changing card backs or having cards be different sizes that you can't shuffle them, I think that this is very minor in the grand scheme of things. Not that I would ever excuse those other things, but I mean, come on. At the end of the day, it's still Smash Up. With regarding to modifier, I found this one to be really interesting because there is an argument for and against it. My argument for it is that if you were redoing the game from the beginning, how would you word these cards? I actually think that the modifier approach is the better approach. If you think about it, how do you search for all the modifiers, all the actions that are played on a base or a minion? In order to search for it, if you have a giant list of cards like we recommend, then you're going to have to search over a couple of things and consolidate the list. If you search for modifier, like character modifier, you now get all the character modifiers or all the minion modifiers, if we had been consistent with that terminology. Same thing would be true for base modifiers. Like I said, if you were doing it over, I actually would prefer that they go that route, which is what other games would do. However, there is one slight quirk that a lot of people may not be familiar with, and that's what is actually being replaced. The definition of character modifier is play on a character. But what's subtle about that is the fact that it's play on a character. If you look at the other actions, you might see play on a minion, play on one of your minions, play on your minion. Now, the latter two are the same. They're still putting the onus on you to put it on your minion. But you'll notice that by being explicit, it's telling you specifically what you're going to attach to. And when you use the phrase character modifier without any other expression, it does raise the question of, is this intended to be for everybody or only for my minions or for my characters? And I actually lost a game one time that I'm still kind of bitter about, if I'm really being honest, because I maintain that the card should not have been, play on any minion, on any character. But that's because it was character modifier, it implicitly means play on a character, and it kind of means like, wow, I'm not going to put any thought into the fact that, is it supposed to go on this unit, or is it supposed to go on every unit? When I actually look at all the modifiers that are in Smash Up, it does raise a question as to whether or not, these cards really should be, particularly when power is involved. There are cases where power can be put on anybody. There are cases where power can only be put on your own minions. So it is sort of an interesting quirk where, and we see this with one of the Masters of Evil base modifiers, where you need to be explicit about the conditions under which it can be played. Normally, the fact that it was the modifier was the condition, like play on a base where you X. Now it's basically base modifier, and then you have to repeat it. It's a small consideration, but it is worth noting and something that we have to keep an eye on for the future. The next rule, one of the most significant ones, is actually something I'm going to be reading verbatim because I need people to get this right. I've seen people quote this and still misinterpret it, so I can't stress this enough. Read this rule and try and memorize it and think about it in practicality. And that is the new specials rule. Don't worry, I'm going to also put this on the screen. So the new special rule says, when resolving abilities while scoring a base, just as when responding to any trigger, you must first resolve abilities of cards in play that do not say may, or that say each player may. These abilities are mandatory. They are resolved in the order chosen by the current player. Then you resolve optional abilities, which includes cards in play that say a single player may do something, as well as all triggered specials in the hand. If more than one player wants to use an optional ability, then each player, starting with the current player and going clockwise, uses one such ability or passes. And the rulebook makes a distinction, actually it doesn't make a distinction between in play or hand. So now you still have the two phases previously. It used to be everything in play, then everything in hand. Now it's mandatory and optional, with optional treating from hand and in play under the same bucket. This is a very important distinction because it makes you wonder how many cards are actually mandatory. And I brought this up before on things like Reddit, but I have every card in the game memorized. Well, that's with an asterisk. Do I know whether or not something says may? Like, is something mandatory or not? That's probably where I would fall through. So off the top of my head, I have to remember, okay, what is actually a mandatory special? And that's really a consequence of the wording that was chosen at the time, because typically specials were interpreted as you can trigger them or not. They're inherently optional. Now we're using the presence of the word may in order to determine whether or not something is mandatory and optional. And it means that you have to be very clear about what you're doing. If you didn't already need to know the specials before, now you need to know the exact wording. Overall, I was on the fence about this rule at first. I think that it is good, and the reason why we wanted to address it with Marvel Smash Up was that the playtesters really wanted an answer to the Hidden Ninja Pack Alpha question. Originally, under the old rules, if you played Hidden Ninja to play Pack Alpha, who has an in-play special, would Pack Alpha trigger? Under the old rules, the answer would be no, because that phase passed. But people had sworn anecdotally that the answer was intended to be yes, and we wanted it answered once and for all. Well, we did, and there's even a clause later on in the rules specifically about it, that if you have something that triggers a mandatory special, then it's going to all of a sudden be triggered immediately. And I believe that Pack Alpha is one such mandatory special. But don't quote me on that. So this is important because it used the opportunity to basically refine the base rule and say, did the specials rule that was introduced around cease and desist go a little bit too far? And that's why it's been reversed. I do like the idea of changing up the order and the flow and not really screwing over cards that are in play. What was basically happening was two things. One, in-play cards were being penalized for being in play because they'd be predictable. In addition to the net loss of value of being predictable, they're also being punished out of order. It was also giving more benefit to the active player because the active player could basically rearrange a ton of specials to suit the order of their choice just because they were the active player. While it is good that we focus the active player sometimes, they shouldn't have all the power in the world because they already get a lot of benefit from being the active player. Usually they're the ones actually breaking the base. It's kind of like having their cake and eating it too. It's a little bit too far. Where the concern came from was, what does this mean for factions that were play tested under the cease and desist rule? Particularly an example would be Lucha Egyptians. So Kappa Roja has an in-play special. Lost Knowledge is an in-hand special. Previously, you couldn't uncover with Lost Knowledge Kappa Roja and expect Kappa Roja to be able to trigger because his phase is passed. Well, now it could. All right, so that combo that was a lot of fun just got a little bit stronger. Cowboy, specifically in the single faction, the Sheriff would always occur before Dynamite Surprise, and Dynamite Surprise requires you to not be winning on the base. But now, you could potentially be not winning on the base, kill someone with Dynamite Surprise, kill the other minion with the Sheriff, and now you have the potential for the Cowboys to solo something in Phase 3. That's obviously a big advantage for them. And you really have to go back and think about, all right, how do all of these factions change? And, is this a change we really want to make? Well, the powers that be decided, yes, that is something they want to consider, and now we have to acclimate ourselves accordingly. I think at the end of the day, it'll end up being okay, but it is, something that you need to consider for a card-based game like this. When you change the rules, what does it retroactively do to faction strength? and it's certainly an interesting topic for discussion, which leads into the third and final rule, and that is regarding the aforementioned witness rule. If you're not familiar with the term, it's one that I made up. The witness rule states that a card must be in play in order for it to respond to triggers. So if you have a card that has a trigger and that causes another card to be played, that card cannot respond to the trigger that caused it. And there was a debate for a long time as to whether or not this rule existed in Smash Up. And there was evidence for and against it. Evidence against it being the famous Oh No power counter that a lot of people were exposed to in March Smashness. They didn't realize it was in the rulebook, that when you play Oh No, you get the counter, and if you get the counter, you also get the card. So where did that end up? Well, if you read the rulebook, you'll notice on the same page that it says, for an ability to respond to a trigger, it needs to be in play when the triggering event happens. For example, if you use Nick Fury to play Maria Hill, she doesn't get +1 from the play of Fury. So Maria Hill has the trigger about playing a character on her base. She gets temporary power, and Nick Fury being able to play another character on the base. Now, if you know me, and if you couldn't guess from the tone of my voice, I am very much against the witness rule. But it's important to state that this is now officially part of the game, and a lot of plays are therefore going to change. And I think it's pretty clear, based on that rule that's been added, that clause that's been added, I want to stress that you should read the card resolution order in general because it clarifies a lot of things, but I'm choosing specifically for the purposes of length and topic to talk about the witness rule application part. So how do I feel about it? Obviously, as I was saying, I'm disappointed. I do like consistency. I believe it's very important to be consistent. I think the game acknowledges that it's been inconsistent over varying periods of time in its history. However, my official position had always been that Oh No is the correct one and everything else is wrong. For example, Secret Agent. Secret Agent can be killed by an action, but still hits you after it's been removed. Now, there was a lot of debate, and I respect a lot of the people who were in part of that, and I've known them for a long time, and we've had this debate for a very long time, years perhaps. But I have to admit, I'm honest, I'm entitled to my opinion. In my opinion, this is a mistake. But why do I feel that way? Well, it has to do with why argue for the witness rule and why argue against it. And remember, I argued against it. What is it actually doing? In my opinion, what it's doing is preventing cards from interacting with each other. Because when you think about it, what were the cases that were being affected by the witness rule? You play Oh No, and it interacts with Gorgonzola because it brings Gorgonzola into play. So you get the counter and you get the card. You can argue that that would be too strong, but I don't think that's a fair argument because the strength should be relative to the net total effect of the rules. The rules should not be written after the fact to determine the strength that you want. The rules should be the constant. And, at the time, the card resolution order favored the reading. My entire argument was that based on a strict reading of the card resolution order, this play was legal and it makes perfect sense. Now, there's a lot of ways that I could argue this, but very often people will argue that in other games, it doesn't work that way, that a card needs to be in play in order to respond to a trigger. Those arguments are pretty meaningless to me because, I'm not going to start bringing up rules of chess or Scrabble or Dominion or really anything. A game is its own sandbox and it has a responsibility to define its own rules. You can take inspiration from another game, but you're not basically a servant to everything that another game does. There are no general purpose rules. Is a discard pile public knowledge? In some games, yes. In some games, no. For every game that's yes, there's a game that's no. You can't just say, well, it works this way in another way in another game. No, you have to define your rules for yourself. But since people are using the topic of other games, I wish I had thought about this a couple of months ago when we were debating it. I'm going to use the example of Retaliate, which is used in Marvel Champions, another Marvel game, and it's used in Gloomhaven, and it's used in other games as well. So the idea of Retaliate is, typically you have some form of character or creature, you deal it damage, it deals you damage back. So the first question in everyone's mind is, if I kill the creature, does it still retaliate and deal damage to me back? And the answer, as far as I can tell, is universally no, because it's dead. If you kill something, it can't, with its last dying breath, hurt you back. And that makes perfect sense. When I saw Retaliate in Marvel Champions, I went to go check the rule, but I'm expecting that the answer is going to be no because it's been defeated, and I'm correct in that regard. But the rules in Smash Up, and again, I want you to read this page carefully, actually imply that, well, if the thing that you did was the reason why the unit was removed from play, then that will in fact trigger. And that doesn't make any sense to me. People would argue that, the rule that I proposed, arguing against the witness rule was counterintuitive. I argue that that case is way more convoluted and doesn't make any sense. But I also think that it really brings up some interesting points as far as timing are concerned, specifically around, do you want cards to interact? And the idea that a card that is going to hurt you really has no counter. It's always going to hurt you. Now, there are cards like Secret Agent and Brownie that are unfortunate wording, but we always hold the wording literally, and cards that are after should really be when. Instead of eroding that to the proper word to make the timing make sense, we're changing the rules and throwing in a bunch of complicated esoteric rules in order to make sense an interaction that really shouldn't make sense. But I want to use Mythic Greeks for an example, because they're a faction that are hurt a lot by this with preventing cards from interacting. And again, yes, I believe Mythic Greeks are strong, but I don't think that rules should determine strength. I think that cards should determine strength. So take a card like Jason, who can react to the first action being in play. If you play the Hatching to play a minion, and you get Jason, would Jason be able to react to the hatching? Similarly, with an easier example that I've used in the past was Lunch Run. If the mechanic plays Lunch Run, can the mechanic draw a card from Lunch Run? Obviously, with those two cards, you want them to interact if you like card interactions. You can say that the answer is no, but what is interesting about the Jason case is that the Jason case is after the first time you play an action. So if the Hatching is the first action, Jason won't be able to trigger it because he was not in play at the time of the trigger. But he also will not be able to trigger to anything because after the first time you play the action has already happened. So in other words, you get the double penalty. It doesn't trigger at that moment, and it will never trigger again. Now you could ask, all right, well, how do you actually get that second action? That doesn't matter, even though there are many ways. What's at the heart of the issue was the fact that experienced players were using the fact that extra plays could be used immediately. Now, there was an argument that was not, intuitive, but I think that it's within the rules, and I think that there is a lot of nuance in knowing when to use a card immediately and when to wait. And if it changes the timing, that's kind of the point of having the timing. Why give someone a choice if you don't want the choice to be meaningful? At least that's what I believe. And in Jason's case, if you did, all right, I'm going to play two actions with Favor of Hermes, and the first one is going to be the Hatching. If that's Jason, okay, if he's not going to trigger to one of the other two, at least let him trigger to the banked action. The fact that he can't do it hurts it, in my opinion. But what's really interesting is that, think about the case of Winning Horse. Let's say that you play the Hatching and you play Jason onto the Wooden Horse. The Wooden Horse has a reaction that after an action is played, a minion there can get +2 power. So on the one hand, Jason can't trigger to the Hatching. But on the other, Wooden Horse will trigger, but be able to select Jason as the benefit of the trigger. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me if I'm being strict about it, because the idea is the thing is pre-triggered so that there's like a state that's pre-made and it just doesn't take place yet until the appropriate time. That was the previous defense that was offered, and that's actually how we justify the fact that Secret Agent will be able to hurt you after he leaves play. Well, how is it that a card is not eligible to trigger but to be the benefit of a trigger? That seems, like it's opposite to me. And, it's really thought-provoking stuff. Are there other games that are, that actually argue against the witness rule? Yes. I've noticed recently that Sentinels of the Multiverse, which I really enjoy, has some really interesting effects that if you are doing damage to all non-hero targets and you kill someone and that brings in a new target, yes, you can go ahead and damage that. Most of the time, that's a very good thing. Sometimes it's a very bad thing. And there's a lot of fun in deciphering, is this going to backfire or not? It's well understood if you know the rules, and I think it's really interesting that it works that way. But I must admit that the primary frustration is actually in the rule itself. Because more than anything, I want cards to interact. And specifically, I personally want cards to interact when they're in the same faction. And the rule is saying that no, Maria Hill and Nick Fury do not work together. The 4 and the 5 in the same faction. And why? So that you can't get one power. I mean, really, one power. That's really unfortunate. It's not just that you're not going to let cards of the same faction interact, but that we're haggling over one power. To me, it's more of the principle because, think about it, the Mechanic the Lunch Run play, all the plays with the Mythic Greeks, plays with Penguins, there are tons of really interesting interactions that can happen in a game that is all about synergy and about cards interacting. I would want the rules to promote the interactions. Well, it doesn't work that way. Cards are not going to be able to work in the same faction. There are ways around it, but the problem is that S.H.I.E.L.D. actually incentivizes you to do a top-down approach. If you think about it, they have cards that can play extra characters, but the majority of extra characters are power 3 or less. So you can play Nick Fury to play Maria Hill immediately. Under the old rules, it would have actually worked, in my opinion, but now it specifically doesn't. So now Nick Fury is in play, Maria Hill's in play, and Maria Hill has reacted to Nick Fury. That's your character. Then you play the action, or you use the talent, from their play on base modifier, to play a minion of power 3 or less, which is Agent Coulson, who can play the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, and now those Coulson and the S.H.I.E.L.D. agent both trigger Maria Hill, and it's just a natural use of your minion and action, and no, it doesn't work. You're going to sacrifice that one power. It actually makes you more restrictive in the order in which you need to play because you have to do everything that you can to play Maria Hill first, and none of the other cards can combine in a way unless you happen to have the extra card that lets you play an extra character. That is extremely unfortunate to me. However, that is the rule. That's how we have to abide by. My personal opinion doesn't matter. It's just important to think about, any time that you make a decision like this, I think it's important to discuss why and why not. And at least once for the record, I haven't had a chance to fully talk about why I argue against the witness rule. I know that it was brought up in the airing of grievances last year, but in case you ever wondered why I feel so passionately about cards interacting, there you go. You probably don't want to hear all about that, but oh well. That's the Marvel Smash Up rules. I do enjoy this expansion. We are doing a giveaway right now. The giveaway has already started by the time that this video has launched. I hope that you participate. Even if you aren't able to win, definitely take a look at the trivia questions because I want that to be fun for people as a chance to combine Marvel and Smash Up. Let me know what you think of the expansion. Let me know what you think of the new rules in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.